The Montana sun was sinking behind the distant mountains when 28-year-old Clara Bennett carried a steaming pot into the ranch kitchen. The meal was simple: potatoes, beans, carrots, herbs, and a little leftover chicken simmered in a thin broth. Clara had learned never to waste food, especially during difficult winters. Around the wooden table sat 45-year-old rancher Thomas Hayes, his younger brother Jake, and 2 ranch hands. Thomas lifted his spoon, stared at the pale soup, and frowned. "That's dinner?" he asked with a mocking laugh. "Looks like warm water with vegetables." The others chuckled, while Clara quietly lowered her eyes and continued serving. Thomas tasted 1 spoonful before pushing his bowl away. "I could drink 3 bowls and still be hungry," he complained. Clara calmly explained that the pantry was nearly empty, and there had been little choice. Thomas shook his head. "A ranch needs proper food, not this." Clara said nothing. She simply returned to the stove and began cleaning the pot. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing the meal, trying to make something comforting from almost nothing. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she refused to argue. Outside, a cold wind swept across the property, rattling the kitchen windows and carrying snow toward the barn. Suddenly, one of the ranch hands looked through the window. "Wait! Isn't that Eli's horse?" Thomas immediately stood. Eli was the youngest ranch hand, only 20 years old, and he had been checking the northern fence before dark. Thomas grabbed his coat and rushed outside with the others. They followed the horse's tracks through the snow and soon found Eli lying beside the trail. He had slipped on the frozen ground and injured his ankle. His face was pale from the cold. They carried him inside and placed him near the stove. Clara quickly wrapped him in blankets, then brought him a bowl of soup. Eli held the warm bowl with trembling hands. He took 1 spoonful, paused, and looked at Clara with surprise. "This is good," he whispered. Thomas stood nearby with crossed arms. "It's only soup," he muttered. Eli shook his head and continued eating. "I haven't had anything since breakfast." Within minutes, the young ranch hand finished the entire bowl and asked whether there was more. Clara smiled sadly. "That was the last full bowl." Before anyone could respond, the kitchen door opened. 70-year-old Mrs. Wilson, Clara's elderly neighbor, stood outside covered in snow. Her stove had broken, and she had eaten nothing warm all day. Clara immediately filled a small container with the remaining soup and handed it to Mrs. Wilson. Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "You're giving away our dinner?" Clara nodded. "She needs it more than we do." Mrs. Wilson thanked her and disappeared into the snowy darkness. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Thomas looked at the empty pot, then at the bowl Eli had finished. For the first time, he understood that Clara had never been trying to impress anyone. She had simply taken what little they had and shared it. The rancher who mocked her soup suddenly wondered what else he had misunderstood about her. The storm grew stronger overnight, covering the Montana ranch in thick snow. By morning, the roads were buried, the water pump had frozen, and nobody could reach town. Thomas checked the pantry and discovered that their supplies were nearly gone. There was only a small amount of flour, a few potatoes, beans, and vegetables. The ranch hands looked worried because they had work to do, but without enough food, they could not continue for long. Thomas remembered Clara's soup from the previous evening. He walked into the kitchen where Clara was preparing breakfast and quietly asked, "Can you make that soup again?" Clara looked at him with surprise. Yesterday, Thomas had mocked the very meal he was now requesting. She nodded and began working. She chopped the potatoes, added beans and vegetables, then mixed in the last pieces of chicken. Instead of complaining about the limited ingredients, she seasoned everything carefully and let the pot simmer. Soon, the kitchen filled with a warm, comforting smell. One by one, The ranch hands entered and sat around the table. Thomas watched Clara serve each bowl. This time, nobody laughed. They were hungry, cold, and grateful simply to have something warm to eat. Thomas lifted his spoon and tasted the soup. He stopped for a moment. The flavor was simple, but every ingredient seemed perfectly balanced. He took another spoonful, then another. Nobody spoke while he ate. Finally, Thomas placed his spoon beside the bowl and looked directly at Clara. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Yesterday, I judged this meal before understanding what went into it." Clara smiled softly. "It's only soup." Thomas shook his head. "No, it's more than that. You made something valuable from almost nothing." Jake looked at his brother and smiled. The rancher who had mocked Clara now understood why everyone trusted her. Just then, someone knocked on the kitchen door. Clara opened it and found Mrs. Wilson standing outside with several neighbors. They were carrying sacks of potatoes, flour, beans, preserved vegetables, and firewood. Clara looked confused. Mrs. Wilson smiled and said, "You gave me your last warm meal yesterday. I told everyone." One neighbor stepped forward and placed a sack beside the stove. "We figured if you could share when you had almost nothing, we could do the same." Thomas stood silently, watching the neighbors unload their supplies. He realized that Clara's kindness had traveled farther than any truck could have traveled through the storm. That evening, everyone gathered around the same wooden table. Clara served another pot of soup, this time with enough ingredients to feed the entire ranch and their neighbors. Thomas raised his bowl and looked at Clara. "To the woman who taught me that a meal isn't measured by how expensive it is." Everyone lifted their bowls. Thomas smiled and added, "And to the best soup this ranch has ever tasted." Laughter filled the kitchen. Clara laughed too, finally free of the embarrassment she had carried the night before. From that day forward, Thomas never mocked a simple meal again. He understood that sometimes the smallest act of kindness could bring an entire community together,